Hey, you're back. Welcome to Season 2 of The People We Meet. My name is Ty Brunner, and I'll be your host. This is a show about ordinary people that have done extraordinary things. I'm glad you're here, and let's get on with it. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The People We Meet. Most of the time, it's conversations. Ordinary people who have done extraordinary things, telling their own stories in their own words. That's a privilege, and it's not something I ever take lightly. But not everyone is still with us for me to find. Some of the most powerful stories belong to people who passed away long ago. People whose choices mattered, whose lives reached further than they ever knew. And when I come across those stories, I don't feel like an owner of them. I feel like a curator. Because when you really sit with them, you realize just how much greatness has already passed quietly through the world. Voices of the Past is where I go to listen closely, to places, to memory, to the traces people leave behind when their lives were never meant to be loud, just meaningful. We're surrounded by noise now. Loud voices, endless opinions, a lot of volume and not always with much depth. This is an attempt to do the opposite, to slow down, to pay attention, and to share stories that still deserve space. Now, this episode begins on Spokane's north side in the Hilliard neighborhood. It stretches across an ocean to a small English village that chose to remember. This is Voices of the Past, and this is where I try to honor the people who came before us. Hilliard didn't start out as a bad part of town. It started out as a destination. In the 1890s, when the Great Northern Railway decided to build its massive rail yard north of Spokane, it didn't just bring tracks and roundhouses with it. It brought jobs, thousands of them, mechanics, machinists, carmen, laborers, families who followed steady work wherever it went. The place was called Hill's Yard, named for James J. Hill, the railroad magnate behind the Great Northern. And for a time, it boomed hard enough that it nearly became its own city. Now, Hilliard had order to it. Small houses with tiny lawns, tree-lined streets, high-ceilinged apartment buildings, a thriving commercial strip along Market Street, lined with shops, theaters, bars, and businesses that catered to working families who expected performance and not charity. By the early 1900s, Hilliard was prosperous, self-contained, and proud. When Spokane formally annexed it in 1924, it wasn't rescuing a failing neighborhood. It was absorbing a productive one. And this matters, because a kid grew up there in the 1920s and 1930s before Hilliard became, the Hilliard that we know today. The rail yard was still running. The Great Northern was still employing thousands. The neighborhood hadn't collapsed. The real decline would come later, after World War II, when diesel locomotives replaced steam, slashing maintenance jobs and hollowing out the economic engine that had built the neighborhood in the first place. That's when disinvestment set in, and that's when reputations hardened. Locals still use that name to refer to the eastern edge of Hilliard, the blocks east of the railroad tracks. There's no official record of exactly how it originated, but neighborhood lore points to two overlapping explanations. One, that the area once had a reputation for loose dogs, which I can attest to, and working-class grit. And two, that it became shorthand for where railroad workers lived and walked home from the yards. Whatever its origin, the nickname lives on in local speech and reflects how people have long understood that section of the neighborhood. But that wasn't the Hilliard of this kid's youth. His Spokane was still a working city, and Rogers High School drew from that reality. Rogers sits on Wellesley Avenue, a couple of blocks from a fire station, and a few more before you hit the 2900 block. Now, there's an old saying, in Hilliard, nothing good happens after midnight and before breakfast. or on the 2900 block of East Anything. It's close to the rail corridor that fed Hilliard and the neighborhoods around it. Now, Rogers wasn't a finishing school. It was a place that turned out people expected to work for a living. People raised around whistles, schedules, and the understanding that showing up mattered. Rogers High School doesn't announce its ghosts. It never has. And I came to know that school decades later, not as a student, but as a firefighter. And at first, I didn't see it clearly. I had a little bit of an awakening. So you'd finally sit down to eat, and the tones would drop. Fire alarm, Rogers High School. You'd put your boots on, throw on your bunkers, jump into the rig, and roll out the door, knowing there was a decent chance that you were headed for a pull station some bored kid yanked for a laugh. Or maybe somebody didn't want to take a test. I don't know. And as you were packing up, some kid would inevitably call out, "Hey, fireman, show me your axe." And I'd be like, "Listen, kid, I didn't put down my lunch, put on all this shit, get in the rig, drive over here, throw my pack, and come tromping in here to show you my axe. I came over here to reset your alarm system because one of y'all thought it would be funny to pull the station again." And in those moments, it was easy to flatten the place into a reputation. It was easy to see the school as the problem and the kids as the reason. But I'll tell you what, that perspective doesn't survive long when you're responsible for protecting a neighborhood. Now, we covered that district. Rogers sat squarely in our first due. Those halls, those classrooms, those kids, they were ours. So we flew the Rogers flag on football days, and we put the pirate stickers on the rig, and they were badass stickers too. Not because it was symbolic. That was our school, and those were our kids. Now, a school isn't defined by what side of town it's on. It's defined by what it turns out into the world. And over time, across generations, long after reputations change, Rogers turned out rail workers, firefighters, mechanics, one rather prolific boxing coach, soldiers, and pilots. Now, one of them walked those halls when Hilliard was still holding together, when Spokane itself was still figuring out what kind of city it was becoming. A rail town, a river town, a place shaped by work as much as by ambition. This is a class in 1939, and that kid's name was Charles Chuck Gumm Jr. And decades before Rogers had a reputation, good or bad, it produced a young man who would one day face a choice that had nothing to do with what side of town he came from and everything to do with who he was. He wasn't the captain of the football team or the king of the prom. He was just a young man moving through a system designed to produce adults who could be counted on. The kind of upbringing that doesn't feel dramatic at the time, but it shows its value later when the stakes are no longer theoretical. Europe was already unraveling while he was still in school. Newspapers carried the headlines, radios carried the tone, and even on the north side, far from any coast, young men understood that distance no longer meant insulation from a world war. After graduation, Chuck went on to Gonzaga University, continuing along a path that looked ordinary on paper. But ordinary paths have a way of intersecting with extraordinary moments when history accelerates. And when the United States entered the war, it didn't feel like a surprise. It felt like the next responsibility handed down the line, like a train arriving whether you were ready or not. So Chuck joined the Army Air Forces. Now, the decision didn't come from bravado. Aviation in that era wasn't glamorous. It was dangerous, technical, and unforgiving. Training accidents were common. Aircraft failed. Men died before they ever even saw combat, and you volunteered knowing that. And somewhere between Spokane's rail line neighborhoods and flight training fields far from home, the habits formed early began to matter. The ones no one called heroic at the time, the instinct to stay with the problem, the refusal to pass responsibility off when you were still capable of acting. Now, pilot training strips illusion away pretty quickly. There's a popular idea that becoming a fighter pilot is about daring, that it selects for bravado, fearlessness, a hunger for risk, and doing the flyby even when the pattern is full. In reality, the process is more surgical than romantic. It's designed to find out who can absorb pressure without drama, who can follow procedure when adrenaline spikes, and who can make clean decisions when the margin collapses to almost nothing. Now, Chuck Gumm entered that pipeline like thousands of other men in the early 1940s. He arrived as a candidate, one of many, about to be tested by a system that had no interest in protecting anyone's self-image. The Army Air Force's training regimen was relentless. Ground school first, navigation, meteorology, engine theory, emergency procedures drilled until they became involuntary. You learned how engines failed, how airframes broke, how men died when they guessed instead of following checklists. The instructors weren't cruel, but they were unsentimental. Aviation did not tolerate improvisation where discipline was required. And you didn't do it until you got it right. You did it until you couldn't get it wrong. And then came the flying. Primary trainers were forgiving, but only slightly. Every mistake was logged, every landing graded. Students washed out quietly and without ceremony. Some were reassigned, some went home, and others disappeared into footnotes no one read twice. Advanced training narrowed the field even further. Single-engine fighters demanded a particular temperament. These aircraft were fast, twitchy, and brutally honest. They rewarded precision and punished arrogance. You didn't muscle them. You worked with them. You learned to read vibrations, subtle changes in sound, the feel of the aircraft through the stick and rudder. Sensory cues that couldn't be written down but had to be lived into the body. And make no mistake, this was where shit got real. A lot of times when mistakes were made, it didn't mean you scrubbed the rest of the exercise and went back to base. It meant you were dead. And by the time Chuck earned his wings, the war had accelerated. Losses were mounting. The need for fighter pilots was urgent. Training times compressed. There was less room for easing into competence. You were expected to arrive ready and adapt quickly. Assignment to a fighter group wasn't a victory lap. It was a statement of expectation. And Chuck was sent to the 354th Fighter Group, one of the earliest American units to operate the P-51 Mustang in combat. At the time, the aircraft was still something of an experiment. Promising, yes, but not the legend that it would become. Early Mustangs were fast and had excellent range, but they demanded respect. Engine management mattered. Fuel planning mattered. Maintenance mattered. The aircraft didn't forgive sloppiness in the air or on the ground. And for pilots transitioning into the Mustang, the learning curve was steep and unforgiving. The airplane was capable of extraordinary performance, but only if you stayed ahead of it mentally. You get behind the aircraft, and it was going to let you know who was in charge. Combat training layered additional pressure on top of all of it. Formation flying, gunnery, tactical maneuvers practiced until spacing and timing became muscle memory. Bomber escort doctrine was still evolving in real time. And the job was not to chase glory. It was to stay with those bombers, to endure long hours in hostile airspace, to resist the urge to break from formation even when provoked. Now, this wasn't the kind of flying that made headlines. It was monotonous, exhausting, and deadly in ways that didn't look heroic from the outside. And some men struggled with that reality. And others, men shaped by places where work was routine and responsibility wasn't negotiable, adapted. And Chuck did more than adapt. By the time the 354th Group reached England in late 1943, he was fully integrated into a machine that demanded that quiet competence. There were no speeches about destiny. There was only preparation, repetition, and the understanding that every mission carried consequences beyond the cockpit. Now, somewhere in that transition, from student to operational pilot, the habits formed in Spokane's rail-shadowed neighborhoods found their use. Show up. Do the work. Stay until the job's done. And soon enough, the Mustang would prove itself. and so would Chuck. He went from a student just trying to make it through pilot training to an aviator that strapped an aircraft to his body and leapt into the sky. Now, like I said, the P-51 didn't arrive in Europe as a legend. It arrived as an answer to a problem the Allies were bleeding men over. American daylight bombing doctrine depended on escort fighters. But early in the war, those fighters simply couldn't go far enough. A P-38 Lightning was badass. It had speed and firepower, but it was complex, maintenance-heavy, and unforgiving in the cold, damp skies over Europe. And the P-47 Thunderbolt was brutally tough, a flying anvil with wings, but it drank fuel like a mofo. It could fight hard, but not for very long. And at the edge of German airspace, it had to turn back. And when the fighters turned back, the bombers went on alone. And these weren't milk runs. Now, a milk run is a short, routine sortie with manageable risk, the kind crews counted on to come home. Deep penetration missions without long-range escort were something else entirely. They were long, exposed flights where survival depended as much on luck as it did on skill. And before the Mustang, loss rates regularly reached 5 to 10% on major daylight bombing missions. In practical terms, that meant a crew could expect to be killed, wounded, or captured after 20 to 25 missions, sometimes fewer. And on the worst days, the numbers were even harsher. During raids like Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943, entire formations were shredded with dozens of bombers lost in a single mission. Losses weren't surprising. They were expected. The United States persisted with daylight strategic bombing for a reason. Flying by day allowed crews to see their targets, aim more precisely, and, in theory, reduce civilian casualties by striking specific factories, rail yards, and infrastructure instead of entire cities. But precision came at a pretty terrible cost. Daylight made bombers visible, predictable, and vulnerable. And the British, having endured catastrophic losses early in the war, had largely shifted to nighttime bombing. Darkness offered protection from fighters, but it came with its own trade-offs. Targets were harder to identify, and bombing accuracy suffered. Civilian casualties were often higher, not by intent, but by consequence. Now, each approach reflected hard lessons learned under fire. British crews faced flak, navigation hazards that killed plenty of their own, and American crews accepted daylight losses in exchange for the chance, however imperfect, to aim more carefully. Now, courage wasn't the issue. Math was the issue. And before long-range escort arrived, the math favored the Germans. And then the Mustang changed the math. Aerodynamically clean and designed for efficiency, the P-51 came into its own when paired with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Suddenly, there was a fighter that could fly high, fly fast, and, most importantly, stay. It could escort bombers all the way to their targets and all the way home. But range alone didn't make the Mustang feared. What made it feared was what happened when it arrived. The P-51 carried 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns, wing-mounted, harmonized to converge at combat range. At closing speeds that erased hesitation, those guns delivered devastating firepower. A short burst was usually enough, and the Mustang didn't need to linger. It struck hard, struck clean, and moved on. It was fast enough to chase, agile enough to fight, and lethal enough that the German pilots learned to recognize it on sight pretty quickly. By 1944, the Mustang wasn't just another Allied fighter. It was a signal of a turning tide. When the P-51 showed up, the airspace was no longer safe, and plenty of German buttholes puckered when they saw that unmistakable and quickly recognized profile. Like I said earlier, the aircraft demanded respect from the men who flew them as well. It was powerful and responsive and utterly honest. It would do exactly what you told it to do, including kill your ass if you mishandled it. And pilots had to stay ahead of it mentally, and there was no room for sloppiness and no forgiveness for ego. The 354th Fighter Group was among the first American units tasked with proving the Mustang in combat. And when they arrived in England in late 1943, They weren't stepping into a finished legend. They were stepping into a weapon system still earning its reputation sortie by sortie and pilot by pilot. Cold airfields, mud, weather that punished engines and nerves alike. Fuel calculations had to be made to the margin. The Mustang was still being learned, still being tested, and still demanding discipline. Now, Chuck Gumm, he flew it the way it demanded to be flown. Precisely, attentively, and without bravado. He didn't try to dominate the aircraft. He worked with it, listened to it, and stayed ahead of it. And on December 16th, 1943, that question mark disappeared. During a bomber escort mission, German fighters rose to challenge the formation. The engagement unfolded the way air combat always did, violently, chaotically, at speeds that allowed no reflection. Seconds mattered. Alignment came and went in blinks. And Chuck engaged and fired. And when it was over, one enemy aircraft was gone. Chalk one up for the good guys. The first confirmed aerial victory by a P-51 Mustang in combat belonged to Charles Gumm from little old Spokane, Washington. Now, the significance wasn't symbolic. It was immediate and practical. It meant the Mustang worked. It meant that the escort could hold. And it meant fewer bomber crews would be left alone in the hostile skies. But there wasn't a whole lot of time to celebrate. Chuck returned to the routine of war. Mission followed mission, escort after escort. And the Mustang continued to prove itself, and the air war began to tilt, not overnight, but decisively. Bomber losses dropped. German pilots were forced into fights they couldn't always choose, and control of the sky began to shift. By early 1944, Gumm had become one of the most effective pilots in a group. His victories accumulated quietly. 6 confirmed aerial kills and several others probable or damaged was enough to earn him the status of flying ace, the first Mustang pilot in his unit to reach that milestone. Now, other pilots noticed not because he talked about it, but because he didn't. Because he stayed disciplined, because he resisted chasing glory that could endanger the formation. History would remember his first aerial victory in a P-51. But it was the accumulation, the professionalism, the consistency, and the willingness to stay with the mission that defined him. And painted on the side of his aircraft was a name that mattered more than any statistic: My Tony. It was a tether to home, a reminder of what waited beyond the war. Now, wars, they're remembered in numbers. Sorties flown, aircraft lost, targets destroyed, victories claimed. History prefers columns and totals because they feel orderly. They make violence easier to manage from a distance. But for the men who flew those missions, war was personal long before it was statistical. And painted on the side of one of Chuck Gumm's Mustangs was a name that never appeared in after-action reports, and that was My Tony, with an I. Tony was his wife, at home, waiting in a world far removed from the roar of engines and the violence in the sky. They had a young daughter as well, an entire life forming beyond the reach of combat, even as it shaped every decision that he made. Naming an aircraft was common among fighter pilots, but the reasons varied. Some chose humor, some chose bravado, and some chose names meant to flirt with luck. Noah's Ark could be crude, funny, defiant, a way to put personality onto a machine that asked everything from you. And Chuck chose home. Now, My Tony wasn't just paint on aluminum. It was the name he carried with him. It represented the reason that discipline mattered, why recklessness was not an option, and why you stayed with the mission instead of chasing glory that might not come with a return. It reminded him that every sortie carried consequences beyond the cockpit. That success wasn't measured only in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in returning intact to his unit, to his responsibility, and to the life awaiting on the other side of the war. By early 1944, Chuck was flying constantly. Escort missions stacked on top of another. Fatigue accumulated quietly, and the danger never announced itself, but it was always present. In the weather, in the engines, in the long hours at altitude, and still, the name remained, a tether to home, a reminder of what really mattered, a quiet weight that shaped his choices. And soon enough, that sense of responsibility would be tested in a way no mission briefing could prepare him for. Not in combat against an enemy aircraft, but in a moment where there would be no formation to rely on, no radio calls to answer, and no margin left to calculate. Just a failing engine and a village below. And a decision that would define everything that came before it. Now, March 1st, 1944 began like hundreds of other days had. Cold, gray, routine. There was no sense that this morning would be different from the ones before it. Aircraft were readied, pilots moved through familiar motions, inspections, checklists, quiet habits that came from repetition. War had a way of making even dangerous things feel ordinary. So the P-51 Mustang lifted from the runway and began its climb. And for a brief moment, everything behaved exactly as it should. Airspeed built, the ground fell away, the aircraft settled into the early phase of flight where attention narrowed to instruments, engine sound, and the subtle feedback every pilot learns to trust. Then the engine faltered, not with smoke or fire, not with drama, just a change. A vibration where there shouldn't be one, a sound that didn't belong. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was failing, and it was doing so at the worst possible time. Low altitude, minimal margin, and no room to experiment. Engine failures close to the ground are unforgiving. There's no altitude to trade for options, no long glide path to think things through. You have seconds to decide, and every second closes doors. And below him lay Nayland, a small English village just waking up. Tight roads, closely spaced houses, sounds a lot like Hilliard, and a churchyard. Civilians who had already lived through years of war without ever consenting to be a part of it. People who had no warning and no control over what might come next. The math was brutal. He could bail out. The aircraft was still airborne. The parachute might open. The wind might carry him clear, and he might survive. Now that option existed, and it wouldn't have been cowardice. No one would have blamed him for taking it. But an unmanned fighter doesn't just disappear. If he left the aircraft now, it would descend uncontrolled. Into rooftops, into walls, into people who had nothing to do with the war he was fighting. And so he stayed. Witnesses on the ground would later describe the aircraft changing directions, not tumbling or spiraling, but being guided, a deliberate turn away from the village. A pilot still very much at the controls, using what little time remained to shape where the aircraft would fall. Every second he stayed reduced his own chances. Altitude bled away, and trees rose fast. And then, the Mustang clipped a tree at the edge of the village. Metal tore, and the sequence ended violently and without spectacle. Chuck was thrown from the aircraft and killed. He was 23 years old. And when the wreckage stopped burning, Nayland was still standing. No homes destroyed. No civilians killed. A village spared by a decision made in seconds. There was no radio call preserved for the record, and no explanation left behind. No opportunity to justify the choice or frame it in heroic terms. And then the war did what the wars do. It moved on. But the people on the ground understood what had happened. Not immediately and not all at once, but clearly enough. They had watched an aircraft that could have come down among them instead be steered away. They lived because someone stayed. The wars move fast, and the front lines shift, and units rotate. Names get folded into casualty lists, replaced by the next set of orders. What feels enormous in the moment can disappear quickly once the machinery rolls on. But villages don't move like that, and Nayland didn't forget. At first, there was only what people knew with certainty. A crash beyond the edge of town. Wreckage where there shouldn't have been any. The unsettling realization that that aircraft could have come down somewhere else, somewhere worse, and didn't. And people talked. not in speeches and not in official language, but in the way small communities always do, piecing together what was seen from windows, doorways, and fields, comparing angles, and recalling the way the aircraft changed direction, how it didn't fall straight in, how it seemed, somehow, intentional. And over time, the truth of it settled in. An American pilot had stayed with his aircraft long enough to steer it away from the village, and he hadn't been obligated to. There was no order that required it, no expectation that civilians should factor into a split-second decision made at low altitude. But they had, and he had. And the people in Nayland understood something else too, something history books often skip over. They understood that this wasn't bravery in the abstract. It wasn't a gesture made for recognition or a reward. It was a private decision made with no guarantee that anyone would ever know. And that mattered. As the war went on and then finally ended, Nayland carried the memory forward, quietly, persistently, the way communities do when something feels unfinished unless it's acknowledged. Years later, a memorial bench was placed near St. James Church, not far from where the aircraft had come down. It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to be. It was just a place to sit. A name, a recognition that no one from Nayland had been hurt or killed on a Wednesday because a young ace fighter pilot with a wife and child on the other side of the pond had stayed at the controls. And at Christmas, villagers sent red poppies across the ocean to his widow in Spokane. Not once, but more than once. A small, deliberate act of remembrance. A way of saying, we know what he did, and we didn't forget. Back home, his burial place was far from Nayland, at Greenwood Memorial Terrace in Spokane. Two resting places tied together by a decision made in seconds and remembered for decades. The war created countless moments like this, choices made alone, without witnesses, without explanation, and most of them disappeared into the noise of history. And this one didn't, because the people who lived in Nayland understood that survival sometimes comes at a cost of someone else's life, and that debt doesn't expire just because the war did. If you walk Rogers High School today, nothing announces what happened in Nayland. There's no dramatic marker at the door, no moment where the building pauses to tell you who once passed through. Students move between classes thinking about the same things students everywhere think about: lunch, friends, and whatever waits for them after the last bell. And that's how it should be. Schools are living places. They're not meant to be mausoleums. And yet, places remember even when they don't advertise it. When I think back on Rogers now, I don't think about the fire alarms or the interruptions or the irritation I felt in those earlier days. I think about that subtle shift that happened without me noticing it at the time. The moment when students of Rogers stopped being those kids and started being my kids. And we didn't protect Rogers because it was perfect. We protected it because it mattered. Because those kids were going to become something, even if nobody at the time could say exactly what that was going to be. Some of them would leave town, some would stay, and some would struggle, and some would surprise everybody. And that's always been true. What history does, unfairly, is compress outcome back to origin. It makes it tempting to look at a person's beginning and say, oh, of course. Of course he turned out that way. Of course this place produced that kind of person. But that's not how that works. Rogers didn't know what it was turning out in 1939. It didn't know that one of its students would fly a Mustang over Europe. It didn't know that a split-second decision over an English village would one day be tied back to its classrooms and its corridors. All it did was what schools are supposed to do when they're doing their job quietly and without fanfare. It teaches kids to show up, to follow through, to take responsibility when it's handed in front of them. Those lessons don't come with guarantees, and they don't announce themselves when they take hold. And they don't always pay off in ways that feel fair, but they matter. And you matter. Where you come from matters. And what you choose to do with it matters. When we flew the Rogers flag at the station or rolled out with the pirate stickers on the rig, we weren't making a statement about rankings or reputation. We were saying something simpler. These kids belong to this city, and this city belongs to them. And that's the part that lasts. Buildings age. Neighborhoods change. Reputations rise and fall. But the work of turning kids into adults, capable, accountable, willing to stay when it'd be easier to leave, carries forward whether anyone notices or not. Rogers doesn't announce its ghosts, but if you pay attention, you realize it doesn't have to. There are kick-ass kids at that school that walk out every single year. History has a volume problem. The loudest moments survive. The biggest battles, the speeches, the dates everyone memorizes because they're easy to point to. What gets lost are the quiet decisions, the ones made without witnesses, without documentation, and without any expectation of being remembered. Those decisions still shape the world. The past isn't gone, it's layered. It lives in places we pass every day without thinking about them. Schools, neighborhoods, streets, villages that kept breathing because someone chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. And that's what Voices of the Past is about. It's not nostalgia or hero worship or rewriting history to make ourselves feel better. It's about listening for the moments that didn't ask to be recorded. Charles Chuck Gumm Jr. didn't know his name would be spoken decades later by people who never met him. He didn't know a bench would bear his name across an ocean. He just knew what was in front of him. Now, his choice didn't make him famous. Shit, it didn't even make the history books. But it made a difference. And sometimes, that's the only measure that matters. This is Voices of the Past. Thanks for listening. Well, that'll about do it for this episode of The People We Meet. But before we wrap up, I want to give a huge shout out to my main man J-Mac over at Studio 42 Recordings. I couldn't do this without you, brother. And much love to my family for their constant support. And most of all, thank you, the listeners. This show exists because you keep showing up, and I don't take that lightly. And if you like what you hear, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook. Give the show a follow and spread the word. And if you know someone with a story that just has to be told, or if that someone is you, drop me a line at thepeoplewemeetpodcast.com. Thank you for listening, and be good to each other.